Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? For those of you that have a reliable, solid fantasy option at the tight end position, kudos, because your season is already way easier than a majority of people out there. But if you're here watching this video, it's probably because you don't have that type of an option, and you need to find somebody that you can trust this week. I hate to break it to you, there may not be very many of those, but we're going to try and dive deep to figure out who we can put in our lineup to at least give us some fantasy value. Right now, the tight end one on the season, Dallas Goedert, has 42 fantasy points. There are 7 kickers that have 42 or more fantasy points so far this season, including Austin Seibert, the Washington kicker, who didn't have any points in week 1. Finding a tight end right now can be extremely difficult, but I'm here to try and make that process much easier for you. So we're going to dive into every single matchup to see who out there we may be able to trust this week. But before we do that, we are doing a huge giveaway right now for anyone that gets signed up over on Underdog during the month of October using code word Headliners. We are picking one lucky person who signs up with our code on Underdog during the month of October to win a full-size framed autographed Jonathan Taylor jersey. And for you to get in on that action, just head on over to Underdog or download the app, create a new account using code word Headliners, and make a deposit of at least $10. Once you do that, you're going to get a super special pick'em that's almost guaranteed to hit. You're going to get a deposit bonus of up to $1,000. And then once you play your first ticket over on Underdog, you're going to be entered for a chance to win that autographed jersey. But this promotion isn't going to last long, so you may want to jump on it as soon as possible. And then you can play along with us in all of the pick'ems that we discuss this week, whether it be in our videos or over on Discord. And on Thursday Night Football, we get one of the best tight ends available right off the bat, George Kittle. The only thing that should keep George Kittle from having a bad day on Thursday Night Football is luck, because everything is set up for him to be one of the best fantasy scorers of the week at the tight end position. He has a touchdown in 3 straight games. But on top of that, Seattle is also allowing the 4th most receiving yards to the tight end position. Now, we do know with this offense, every once in a while, George Kittle is going to disappear. So if for some reason he disappears on Thursday Night Football, I'm really sorry for that. But if you're putting George Kittle in your lineup, do you realistically have anybody else that you would be able to trust anyway? Just keep your fingers crossed that nothing weird happens on Thursday night. Noah Fant saw his snap share jump to over 70% in week 5, which for the fantasy landscape is great for the tight end position. But there's a problem. Jackson Smith-Njigba, Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf, and excluding last week, they run the ball an awful lot with Kenneth Walker. So unfortunately, Noah Fant just isn't seeing a ton of volume coming his way. You can lock him in for like 2 to 4 targets per game, but it just hasn't been consistent enough for him to find his way into our fantasy lineup. And by the way, on top of that, San Francisco's allowing the 4th fewest receiving yards to the tight end position. Everyone who drafted Evan Engram has been waiting patiently for him to make his return, and it really sounded like he was going to be back last week. And unfortunately, that didn't end up happening. But I think it's time to stop talking about when he will be back and start talking about whether or not he'll even have a job when he comes back. Since Evan Engram went down with his injury in week 1, Brenton Strange has scored 2 of 4 weeks. And one of the weeks that he didn't score, he had 62 receiving yards. So he's been fantasy viable 3 of the last 4 games. That's going to make things extremely difficult for Evan Engram. What happens when he comes back? They run a bunch of 12 personnel, and then Brenton Strange doesn't leave the field. At this point, I think he's earned it. So if Evan Engram does return this week, I do consider him to be a high risk. And if you're starting him, it makes sense because you may not have any other options. If Evan Engram does return, Brenton Strange is also a high risk for me, and I'm not going to be playing him this week. But if Evan Engram doesn't return again, I would go with Brenton Strange as a medium risk, touchdown dependent play. Cole Kmet's fantasy value is really in flux right now. The first thing that he had to defeat this year was the fact that Gerald Everett was seeing the field so often. That is done, and Cole Kmet is now on the field as the lead tight end. In the snap share, there is a huge gap now between Kmet being the number 1 and Gerald Everett being the number 2. The second thing he has to overcome, though, is the amount of wide receivers. DJ Moore is clearly the wide receiver 1. That is set. That is done. Cole Kmet still has a shot to become the number 2 target on this team. Keenan Allen has been banged up, and he may not have the same get up and go that he did before the injury, and of course being another year older. Rome Odunze, he's doing a solid job, but as a rookie, he's going to have some inconsistencies. If Cole Kmet can start to become the number 2 target on this team consistently, then he's absolutely going to be a top 5 tight end option every single week. But if we start to see the gap close between DJ Moore, Rome Odunze, and Keenan Allen, and we start to see a high fluctuation between Cole Kmet either being the number 2 target or the number 4 target, that's going to make things way more difficult to start Cole Kmet on a weekly basis. Not only is Trey McBride one of the most dependable tight ends in fantasy football right now, but he may be one of, if not the safest on a consistent basis. And this week he gets the Green Bay Packers in a smash matchup who allow the 8th most fantasy points to the tight end position in 2024. I'm sure a lot of you are here to talk about Tucker Kraft. This was a dark horse candidate for me over the offseason. Somebody that had a really good stretch of games down the end of the 2023 year and potentially could have resumed that role, even though Luke Musgrave is kind of the sexier name there. Tucker Kraft is absolutely the tight end 1, and we don't really need to worry about Luke Musgrave anymore. But I still think we need to be concerned about his potential floor, especially with running the football and all of the wide receivers he has around him. Now, last week, you were only really competing with Dontavian Wicks and Jaden Reed, but Christian Watson is going to end up being healthy again at some point in time, and Romeo Doubs should end up being back and out of the doghouse this week. Tucker Kraft, I really want him to become a thing and stay super consistent. I do think he's going to have one of the better ceilings in all of football because of how much Green Bay does pass the football. And when Jordan Love is your quarterback, you've always got a shot. But if for some reason a majority of the targets go the other direction towards the wide receivers, it could lead to some underperforming, underwhelming fantasy days. The Indianapolis and Tennessee matchup brings some potential, but not enough for me to buy into it. Mo Alley-Cox scored a touchdown last week. I really don't know if we're going to be able to bet on that continuously, especially going up against Tennessee, who allows the fewest fantasy points per game to tight ends. Indianapolis is currently allowing the 5th most receiving yards and 3rd most fantasy points to the tight end position. They're also tied for the most touchdowns allowed to tight ends right now. This is a great matchup for the Tennessee tight ends, but they've got 3 of them that they're rotating on a consistent basis, and because of that, we really never know who the guy is going to be. If you want to pick someone this week, one of them probably ends up having a decent game, but the best part may be you just throw a dart and hopefully it hits the right one. If you've been looking for someone to fill in at the tight end position, we may have our guy for at least a couple of weeks. And that's why Dalton Schultz is going to be my Manscaped must-start tight end for week 6 of the NFL season. New England is currently allowing the 6th most receiving yards to opposing tight ends. And last week after Nico Collins left the game, Dalton Schultz saw 6 targets. If you can get me a tight end that's getting 6 targets every single game, I absolutely will buy into that. And if you're looking to start buying presents for the holiday season, then Manscaped is definitely the way to go. With their long line of tools, you'll be able to find something for everyone in your family. And right now, all you got to do is head on over there, fill your cart up with everything that you need, and then use code HEADLINERS20 at checkout for 20% off your entire order and free shipping. It is looking like Nico Collins is going to miss extended time. He went from being day-to-day to week shortly after the game. Because of that, Dalton Schultz is going to have a much firmer place in this game plan for Houston and could end up being one of the safer bets at tight end for the next few weeks. Cade Otton is going to find himself in a favorable matchup this week, going up against the Saints, who allow the 3rd most receiving yards to the tight end position. Not a whole lot of ceiling with Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, but if Mike Evans struggles on the outside and sees a limited ceiling, he could end up scooping up a few of those targets that would typically go to Evans. Cade Otton, I'm feeling like, could end up giving us a decent fantasy week. Last week, Foster Moreau was able to find the end zone. Juwan Johnson, he ended up leading the tight ends in targets, but Taysom Hill was out. Will he end up missing this week as well? We may have to discuss these options a little bit later in the week during our live shows or our rankings. Basically, anybody you play at the tight end position has a really good chance of sucking that week, so why not risk it with David Njoku? At this point, do you really have anybody that you're going to play over him that gives you a better shot? There may only be like 6 or 7 guys that you could say, yep, he's got a better chance. David Njoku may end up being limited once again. He only played 20 snaps last week. So unless you have one of those top guys that we talk about in this video that I feel really good about, David Njoku is probably just as good a bet as anybody to have a decent day this coming week. With A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith hurt the last couple of weeks, Dallas Goedert saw a big explosion in terms of fantasy points. But Brown and Smith are both expected back in week 6. And if that ends up happening, what role do we see from Dallas Goedert at that point? Just be cautious with that. He doesn't have the ceiling that he had the last couple of weeks, but his floor may still end up being okay as long as the game script stays neutral. The Baltimore Ravens have allowed 368 receiving yards to the tight end position so far this season, by far the most in the league. And last week, Zach Ertz saw 8 targets, which tied with Terry McLaurin for the team lead. Now, he doesn't see a whole lot of ceiling because he's not being looked at in the red zone. But if we can get another 6 to 8 targets from Zach Ertz in a really good matchup, he definitely has the floor of a top 12 tight end. Washington is currently allowing the 4th fewest receiving yards to the tight end position. The tight end position for Baltimore was already a huge problem. Welcome in Charlie Kolar to make it even worse. At this point, I'm essentially done with Mark Andrews. If you've been thinking about dropping him, it's going to hurt. And it could still end up biting us in the butt. But I'm probably going to go ahead and do it at this point in time. He's very dependent on the type of personnel that's being run. It doesn't matter the score. It doesn't matter the game script. It just matters on what type of personnel Baltimore is going to run more that week. However, in 22 personnel near the goal line in the red zone, all of a sudden Charlie Kolar appeared out of nowhere. And because of that, Mark Andrews, for the most part, is being left off the field where it matters most for the tight ends. People are going to want to start Isaiah Likely, and you're going to try to run him out there because he just scored 2 touchdowns. I get that, but he only had 3 targets. Charlie Kolar and Isaiah Likely. Charlie Kolar, we're not playing him. We're not picking up. We're not doing any of that with him right now. We need to wait and see what happens over the next couple of weeks to see if he's going to start playing way more than what Mark Andrews does. For Isaiah Likely, you're going to want to play him. And more than likely, you probably should based on what you have on your team. But one of 2 things is going to happen. He's going to be a top 5 tight end for the week, or he's going to be a guy that gives you 0, 1, 2, 3 fantasy points. There's no in between with Isaiah Likely. If it's a negative game script, Isaiah Likely is going to be great. If it is a positive game script and a matchup that the Baltimore Ravens should win, probably starting Isaiah Likely is not in your best interest. I can make the Chargers-Broncos analysis pretty short and sweet. The Chargers have a decent matchup this week at the tight end position, but right now they're rotating a couple of guys there, and no one has been able to establish themselves yet. Maybe Hayden Hurst has a decent day because they're not going to be able to target the outside that often because of Patrick Surtain, but really it's hard to guess who's going to be the guy in any given week for the Chargers. For the Denver Broncos, just say no. It doesn't matter who, where, when, how. If we're thinking about the tight end for the Denver Broncos right now, there's so many other options that we could try. I really don't know what to make of the Pittsburgh Steelers sometimes. It really feels like the last couple of years, there's no rhyme or reason to their offensive game planning. And sometimes that's a good thing at the NFL level, but in Pittsburgh's case, it's not. Like, George Pickens was number 3 on the team in snaps behind 2 other wide receivers. And apparently they're trying to give him more quality snaps instead of quantity. But why aren't we using a guy like Pat Freiermuth more often who had only 3 targets? Now, he was able to find the end zone. That's great. But it's not like Justin Fields doesn't like his tight ends. Him and Cole Kmet were excellent together in Chicago. So why isn't Pat Freiermuth being worked into the game plan more often? It just doesn't make sense. Weeks 1 and 2 for Brock Bowers, awesome, top fantasy tight end. Weeks 3 and 4 for Brock Bowers, not great, not fantasy relevant. Week 5, awesome, 12 targets, 8 receptions, over 90 receiving yards. Dude looked awesome. That's great to see. But hopefully this carousel of rotating quarterbacks doesn't end up killing him at any point in time, because it's already done it to Davante Adams. We don't need to do it to Brock Bowers as well. I know overall people haven't been super happy with Sam Laporta, but he does have 2 weeks finishing inside the top 12 tight ends. He hasn't really found his ceiling as of yet, but that doesn't mean that he won't at some point in time. The Lions offense really got going last couple of weeks, and hopefully it continues to move forward, because if that's trending up, Sam Laporta will be trending up as well. And quite honestly, how many guys out there are you going to be putting in your lineup that have the same upside that Laporta does? Jake Ferguson, another solid week. 7 targets, 6 receptions, 70 receiving yards. And going up against the Lions, hopefully he ends up being the number 2 target, number 3 at the very least. And what could be a neutral game script with a whole lot of back and forth, Jake Ferguson has another solid fantasy week ahead of him. You know what really sucks about this Atlanta and Carolina matchup? Kyle Pitts is literally the only Atlanta player that I'm worried about. I'm not worried about Kirk Cousins having a good day. I'm not worried about Bijan Robinson or Darnell Mooney or Drake London. I'm not even worried about Tyler Algier not giving us some sort of fantasy startable performance. Kyle Pitts is literally the only one that I can't trust in this matchup, because it's the same thing that we've seen from him. The dude disappears for weeks on end and then comes out of nowhere with a fantasy performance. So you got to ask yourself, are you feeling lucky, punk? Are you? Because more than likely, you have to start Kyle Pitts, and you should start Kyle Pitts. But more than likely, you're also going to be watching that box score very closely, hoping that Kyle Pitts doesn't screw it up. For Carolina, Tommy Tremble is dealing with a concussion, more than likely missing this week. Jatavian Sanders may end up stepping in his place and being the lead tight end of this group. But until this offense gets way more consistent, I'm not banking on any of the tight ends. I'm not necessarily off of guys like Deontay Johnson or Chuba Hubbard or even Xavier Legette if he's feeling better and out there this week, but we'll have to watch all of that and just see what happens. So far in this video, we've mentioned a few options that probably give you a decent floor at the tight end position this week. Unfortunately for this matchup, there's nobody that I'm really trusting here over some of the other guys that I've already discussed. Eric All is seeing a little bit of an increase in his snap percentage, but it's not a ton to become overly concerned or worried about him being fantasy viable right now. Maybe that changes over the coming weeks, but Mike Gesicki is still out on the field quite a bit as well. And for the New York Giants, Theo Johnson was pretty decent last week. But once again, we got to start seeing something a little bit more consistent, especially when it comes to snaps and targets, for us to start adding him to our lineup on a consistent basis. Luckily enough, Monday Night Football is going to bring us back to a couple of tight end options that we can take a stab at. Dalton Kincaid, if you drafted him, you're probably still continuing to start him. Hopefully at some point he starts putting together consistent fantasy weeks. And if things are tough on the outside this week, or if Khalil Shakir is missing once again, Dalton Kincaid could have a decent day. We just need to get him some more targets. Tyler Conklin should end up being a decent fantasy option once again this week. He should see some solid target numbers, but really you don't want any type of a positive game script for the New York Jets. If they're able to do that, they could end up running the ball a lot more than what we would like to, control the clock, and Conklin may not see those targets. But this is a tougher matchup on the outside for the wide receivers, so maybe Tyler Conklin can get a few more targets and be fantasy viable once again. Well, there you have it, Headliner Nation, my start and sit analysis for the tight end position. Make sure you head on over to Underdog and get signed up so you can be entered to win that autographed framed Jonathan Taylor jersey. But for now, I'm moving on to wide receivers. Everybody have a great rest of the day, stay safe and healthy, and I'll catch you all on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliner.